Are you looking for a nice velvet philodendron that's easy to grow? Well, I've got the answer for you, Philodendron Splendid. I've had the easiest time growing this plant over the last 3.5 years, and in today's video we're looking at the journey that the plant and I have been through together. We're then going to chop it in half because, well, it just reached the top of its moss pole, and I'll talk to you about anything that I learned about this plant. So, let's go. Come on, my baby, let's go. Big chop today, big chop. Coming through. Whee! In today's video, we're chopping my Philodendron Splendid in half. Alrighty, I have to hold on to this plant. It is way too top heavy and it was just wedged into the corner of my plant room for the last couple of months. I'm just going to hold on to this for dear life while I'm going to talk to you about the journey that the plant and I have been through over the last few years. So it all started off just 3.5 years ago with a single node cutting of this plant. This plant was actually very expensive just 3 to 4 years ago in Australia. By now they came out of tissue culture and are much more affordable, but back then a single node cutting was the best I could do. I popped it on the moss pole pretty quickly. As soon as I saw some decent roots of that propagation, I potted it up and I used my moss pole, a regular 90 centimeter moss pole, and I potted it on there just 1 month after I received it. The plant then started its journey up the moss pole, and I'll pop in a photo on one of these sides where you can see what this plant looked like exactly 3 years ago. So slowly starting the journey up the moss pole, but you can see it definitely started increasing in leaf size pretty quickly. 1 year later, the plant has had a chop and extend already. So it grew up a moss pole, I extended it, I chopped it, and I extended it again, and it grew up that extension as well. So by then that moss pole would have been about 270 centimeters tall if I wouldn't have chopped it once. And the plant reached the top of that moss pole again, and by then you can see that the plant has definitely continuously increased in leaf size, but not quite as big as it is by now. And from there on, I just repeat the process. Every 6 to 8 months, depending on the growing seasons, this plant is reaching the top of its moss pole yet again. I cut it in half, I re-extend it, and I keep going. And that's exactly what we're doing in today's video. The last chop and extend was exactly 8 months ago. So let's have a really quick look at what happened with the last chop and extend. This is my Philodendron Splendid. It came crashing down on me twice recently. It is just way too top heavy. And the only other plant I have this problem with is my Philodendron Glorious, but the Glorious actually is where there's like a little hook in the wall, so I kind of hooked the Glorious into the wall. This one doesn't have a hook, so it came crashing down on me twice. So you can see a little bit of damage here. It is also pushing out this brand new leaf over here, but I'm just so worried that it's going to fall. I can hardly water it at the moment, like without kind of having to hold on to it. So time for a chop and extend, because I don't enjoy having plants that are really hard to manage. Alrighty, this is the bottom half. I will do nothing with this. Oh, I might see if it needs a repot, given that I am passing it on. Pop that on here now. Let's have a look at this. You see these juicy roots over here? Well, these roots want to attach to something. If I would now wait longer to do the extension, the next node and so on has nothing to attach to. If you don't give your plant something to attach to, then it's not going to thrive to its full potential. Beautiful, and here we are. As you can see, this is the first leaf after the chop and extend, followed by this, followed by this, and then this one is the last one. From the last leaf before the chop to the first leaf after the chop, there is literally no change in leaf size. So it just proves that the chop and extend method is a success if you're following the principles. The principles of this chop and extend process is to rely on the root system within the moss pole, which is huge for this plant. Let me take a little video for you. every single node has grown roots into the moss pole, so every single leaf basically has its own little root system to support it. That's why the plant is having such an easy time growing up nice and large. Of course, first and foremost, the conditions will always set the potential for this plant to grow, and I'll talk to you more about these conditions in a second. Now today, it has reached the top of the moss pole again. The latest node over here is currently not touching the moss pole. So before this node starts growing some aerial roots, I want to extend it so that these aerial roots can then actually grow into the moss pole and turn into proper water roots, contributing to the size of the root system. The more roots, the better. Now you will also notice that a lot of these roots aren't actually going into the moss pole, they're kind of going around the moss pole, and that's also okay. Of course I want to maximize the root system, so sometimes I kind of just take them and I kind of push them into the moss pole in hope that they will expand and build an even larger root system, but it's also okay. In nature, these roots would actually be anchoring roots. They would help the plant anchor to the bark of the tree. Now of course from that bark they can absorb some nutrients and potentially some water as well when it rains and so on, but in nature these would just be mainly for support purposes, for anchoring as it says. With the moss pole there's going to be a mix of anchoring roots but also proper water roots that have built a thick root system within the pole in itself. But I'm not super fussed about it. It's obviously not fully optimizing the potential. Not that this plant needs to grow any larger than it already is, but if you would want to further optimize the potential, I could give it a larger moss pole, I could give it a plastic back moss pole and making sure I funnel more roots into the pole. But well, this open style moss pole that I make myself has worked really well for this plant and myself over the last 3.5 years, so I'm not going to fix what's not broken. Okay, this is going to be challenging to do because I can't let the plant go, but I've done the chop and extend method a few times and there's more detailed tutorials on here as well, but I'm going to kind of quickly narrate the process while I'm also going to talk about the plant and the conditions of this plant, or the conditions that I grow this plant in. In preparation for the chop and extend this morning, I cut a gap in the stem exactly where the two moss poles meet so that that can dry out, because I want to pot this up straight away as part of this video today. Now I'm just going to cut the cable ties that connect the two poles. So all of my moss poles are always 90 centimeters. So this is two moss poles stacked on top of each other. Let me talk to you about this plant a little bit more. So this is Philodendron Splendid. And Splendid is a hybrid of Philodendron verrucosum and Philodendron melanochrysum. So the verrucosum parentage comes through with these really beautiful red backs. I'll show you them later in a bit more detail when I get closer, or when I can come closer to the camera. And the Melano parentage gives it these beautiful elongated dark leaves. Now, as with every hybrid, sometimes one or the other parentage can be a little bit more dominant, and that means that sometimes these leaves could be a little bit rounder, sometimes a little bit more elongated, sometimes more red, sometimes less red. But some of these differences can also be attributed to conditional changes. Right? If you grow it with more light, the leaves are usually getting a little more narrow and so on. Alrighty, so I cut all of this. So yeah, sweet. This just comes off easily. Now this is the bottom part of the pole. We're just going to park this on the side and we decide what to do with this later. It might be a little present for Timmy. Now I can come a bit closer. This is much better. So you can see a huge root system has formed in and around the moss pole. And again, you could optimize the root system further by putting a plastic backing on here, so all of these roots are funneled into the pole and then down into the pot. But I honestly wouldn't really know where to put this plant if I would optimize its growth even further. I'm more than happy with the way that it is growing. And you can also see these red backs, so the verrucosum parentage coming through quite nicely, and it also shows in these nice electric veins. Now this is the newest leaf. It only recently unfurled, so it is still kind of trying to inflate with a bit of water, but given the amount of roots that it has, I don't think this chop is really going to negatively impact the development of this plant. But we'll ultimately, well, We don't need to wait. We know, because I've been doing this process with this plant 3 to 4 times. This leaf's development would pan out to be the exact same as this leaf's development, and quite clearly this leaf is doing just fine. So this was the first leaf after the last chop, and then this will be the first leaf after the new chop. I'm just doing this process over and over again by now. So I think, as I said, this should be the 3rd or 4th time that I'm going through the chop and extend with this Splendid. And if it wasn't for the chop and extend, this plant would now be 4 meters tall or something like that, which is just completely unrealistic in an indoor environment. But with the chop and extend, I can keep the plant at a manageable height. It will never be more than 180 centimeters tall. Or well, the pole is 180 centimeters tall. I suppose the plant is another 30, maybe 50 centimeters taller than that. But it was always fairly manageable, while at the same time giving the plant the opportunity to continuously mature, which it obviously had. It came from this tiny cutting, and by now it is this big. Now there's a bit of moss at the bottom, of course. I'm trying to remove a little bit of it without destroying the root system, just because that part will be in aeroid mix, and the moss has really high water retention. But sometimes I don't remove any of it if there's too many roots in here, and so far I haven't really seen any issues. And you can see that over here the cut has already nicely calloused over, which is just a thing I do to mitigate the likeliness of rot. I forgot to get a pot. Please don't fall. Or if you fall, please don't break. Just stay. Stay. Alrighty, we stick into a 20 centimeter pot, which I know is very small, and this plant has, over the last 2 chop and extends already, or the last 2 times it reached the chop and extend stage, this plant was so incredibly large. It was getting so top heavy, it was hard to maneuver it around or move it around, or even hard to stop it from just falling. So with the last chop and extend, I actually gave it a larger pot, but that didn't actually do anything. So I'm sticking to the smaller pot, and my approach to ensure that this isn't falling is wedging it into a corner and or having a little hook on the wall to hook the moss pole in as well. I'm going to top this up with my normal aeroid mix. As always, it's nice and chunky, especially when I'm potting up a moss pole, and my aeroid mix tutorial is always linked in the description as well. Now this in itself is obviously not going to make it very stable, so what I also do is I'll tilt it, I'll pot it up with a little backwards tilt. It will become more apparent once I extend it, I believe. And what I'll also do is I'll pop this into a heavy decorative planter like the one I've got next to me, ideally with a really nice tight fit so that the pot can't wiggle around in the planter, and that should ensure that the plant isn't so top heavy. But of course that only works to a certain extent. Once these plants have huge leaves like the one I'm holding, and all of the leaves are facing in the same direction, it's obviously going to get front and top heavy, hence the additional hook on the wall now going forward. So I'm just repurposing the garden stake that I removed earlier. And cable ties. The reason why this plant has a very consistent presentation side is twofold. Number one is because of the pollen itself, and let me show you. One moment. This leaf has technically come out on the back of the stem, right? Ideally you want all of the leaves to come from the front and then face the front. This one, this stem, this petiole came out on the back. So if it wasn't for the moss pole, this leaf would have actually gone this way. But I used the moss pole to kind of pin the stem in, pin the petiole in behind the stem. I don't know how to explain this, but you know what I mean? Instead of it going here, I kind of maneuvered it this way and twisted it so it now still points forward. Now I'm going to have a spare moss pole over here. At the top, I'm going to make a little cavity for the upside down water bottle technique to work later on. Beautiful. Maybe a little more moss. And I'm going to fill this little gap over here with moss so we don't actually end up having a gap. And put this in here. The second thing I do to give this a consistent presentation side is light exposure. So this plant is wedged into a corner. So obviously on two sides of that corner there would be a wall. So it really has like 90 degrees of light exposure, if that makes sense. And that's obviously where all the leaves are going to face. The leaves will want to face the light. So a consistent light source can help you create that consistent presentation side, if that's what you want. Of course, if you want to have a plant that grows 360 around the moss pole, then you can use the same principle and apply accordingly. Now I'm just going to connect the two moss poles via cable ties as well, after I secured the extension to the garden stake. But if you grow it 360 around the moss pole, I would probably recommend adding 2 or 3 cuttings to the moss pole. You could even, what you could do is you could take the bottom part of the moss pole, the one that I've got standing over there, and pot it into the same pot with the top, and then just extend one of them and then let both of them grow up, and then eventually, you know, you'll have 2 shoots on that top and so on. I can't do that because it would just spread way too much. This plant is already taking up a lot of real estate and it needs to calm down and share a little bit, you know. But if you would want to have it in the middle of a room and like really maximum impact, then I would add multiple plants to the same pot to really make it as lush as possible. I'm more aiming for one nice display side, and I think by now my leaves are so large I don't need to aim for lush and large. I usually aim for lush or large. Very occasionally I'd aim for both. And that's it already, right? It obviously stands a little bit better now that it's shorter. So I don't have to worry about it falling consistently, which is just good, because at this stage, yes, of course I'm aiming for really beautiful, nice, large leaves and lushness, but I'm also aiming for ease of execution, for the ease of caring for it, for the ease of taking it outside and just hosing it down without having to worry about it and so on, right? So I'm gonna have a much easier time looking after this plant, and having an easy time looking after a plant makes me appreciate the plant even more. Now, coming back to the statement I gave you at the very beginning. This is one out of 2 velvet philodendrons I really recommend for anybody who wants to start dabbling into velvet philodendrons. Velvets are usually not the easiest to care for. They're really fussy when it comes to conditions, specifically humidity. However, with the hybrids, so Splendid as well as Glorious, I've noticed that they're much easier going. There's something called hybrid vigor, and the best way I have found to explain it is really using the wise words of Hannah Montana. You get the best of both worlds. It basically combines the best parts of both parents. In general, hybrid vigor explains the phenomenon of plants having more resilience as a result of being a hybrid. Also, the way that hybrids are chosen, I think Henderson picked out this hybrid, or created and picked this hybrid. They're obviously produced via seed, so Milano would have been pollinated with verrucosum, and then there's, I don't know, hundreds of seeds and so on. They would have obviously chosen the most vigorous growers, the seeds that obviously display the nicest pattern and so on, but also the ones that are just have the best chances of surviving. So purely from a selection process that goes into creating hybrids, you could expect that the hybrids are usually a bit easier going than the species when it comes to ease of care or ease of growing. Now, hybrids can have some other disadvantages. Some of them might be sterile and so on, but it is what it is. This one actually flowered for me as well, at least once, and I pop in a photo that I found. So it is definitely capable of producing flowers. I'm not too sure if anybody has ever tried to make any hybrids with Splendid before. I might need to ask Tim. I feel like this would be something he would probably do. Other Tim, Grow Vertical Tim. But yeah, I personally have no real desire to create hybrids with philodendron. Philodendron pollination is quite tricky. I'll leave that up to Tim from Grow Vertical to do that. My goal is really to grow it into a nice statement piece. Now I can see a new flower developing over here as well. Let me maybe bring that closer to you. I don't know if you can see that in that newest petiole over there. here we go, there's a new flower coming. So as soon as this is kind of large enough for me to cut off, I will. I do not want this plant to waste any energy into growing an inflorescence rather than growing leaves. Specifically, now that I chopped it. The plant doesn't know that I chopped it, so well, now it knows. The plant might even abort the flower given that I just gave it a chop. But the whole thing about the chop and extend method, and I know I sound like a broken record, I talk about it all the time. The whole thing about the chop and extend method is that the plant is impacted as little as possible. We're taking cuttings where the size of the cutting is in proportion to the size of the root system, because each node comes with its own root system brought to you by yours truly, the moss pole. That way, it doesn't matter whereabouts on the moss pole I do the chop, it will always be in proportion. Whereas if this plant would have not had a massive root system growing within the moss pole by the time I chop it, I now end up with a huge cutting with no roots, and this is exactly what happened to my Philodendron glorious, the other hybrid I just mentioned earlier. Also a super easy grower, also a plant that sized up really quickly for me. It's probably the biggest plant I actually have, even larger than the Splendid, but it grew off the moss pole and I was a bit light in getting on top of it. So by the time I got to do a chop and extend with my glorious, none of the nodes above the chop actually had a root system. So I am still in the process of rooting that top cutting, and it's been 3 months so far, and having a huge cutting with huge leaves but no roots to provide that cutting with any sort of water or nutrients will obviously result in existing leaves dying off and new growth being really small. Now, proof is in the pudding. I am working on a video of that glorious for you post the chop, because it was the first time I actually did a chop and extend without listening to my own principles, if that makes sense. So stay tuned for this one, but with this one I'm really just copy and pasting what I've already done multiple times before. So I'm expecting absolutely no setback with this plant, exactly in the same way as we did not see any setback from the last chop and extend I did 8 months ago. Now, I mentioned that these hybrids are a little bit easier to grow than some of the species. However, I'm still trying to optimize the conditions that I can give that plant to really make it thrive. Survival would be possible in even lower humidity ranges, but I'm giving this plant between 60 to 70% humidity, and I think that's really enabling to get the best out of it. The temperatures, now that we're heading into winter, can actually go down to about 16 degrees. In summer, it can be up to 28 degrees in the room that I'm growing it in, so there's a bit of a range, but I would definitely avoid anything under 16, and I would say on average it's probably between 20 to 22 degrees in there. So nice and warm, but definitely not hot like in a hothouse. I do have a fan in that room, so there's always airflow, which just enables the plant to grow nice and strong. But first and foremost, it prevents any fungal issues. Specifically, having so many moss poles in the room, there's obviously a lot of moisture in the air, and the airflow is just ensuring that there's no fungal issues with any of the leaves or the moss poles in themselves. So don't ever underestimate airflow. So those are kind of the conditions that I grow them in, but this plant should be tolerant to lower humidities, more challenging temperatures, and so on, if you compare that to verrucosum or melanochrysum, either of its species. So if you want to get into moss poles, this is a great one to start off with. I need to get this plant outside, give it a shower and some water, but you guys are in the way between us and the outside world, so I will say goodbye for now. I hope you enjoyed this little recap on this plant's journey, as well as a little recap on my chop and extend method. Thank you so much for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you next time. Bye!